Hello, my name is Jeremy Barnes, and today I'm going to do a review for the Hawkeye series on Disney Plus. The finale just came out on Wednesday, and I did a whole rewatch of the whole series leading up to the finale. So I've been able to formulate all my thoughts about the show overall. And I actually liked the show a lot more the second time compared to the first time, but what I will say overall is that Hawkeye had a very solid story throughout, from the beginning to the end of the season, but overall it wasn't as exciting as some of the other Marvel shows or most of the movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Um, what I will say is that Hawkeye is definitely the coolest that he's ever been in the MCU, but for me personally, he still isn't cool enough for me to really care much about what he's gonna do later on, like after the show. And I really do kind of hope he just stays retired, which he's been trying to do since Civil War. Um, So if they finally let him do that and just live his life, and after the show he passed the baton on to Kate Bishop, and she'll become the Hawkeye going forward in the MCU, that would be fine with me. And besides Kate Bishop, I am excited for some of the other new characters that were introduced in the show, like Maya Lopez, who was actually one of the adversaries in the show, um, and also the returning character Yelena Belova from the Black Widow movie, and she was obviously Natasha's like adopted or false sister from the KGB like spy era within the U.S. that we saw in that movie. Um, so I'm definitely excited for these like three characters going forward. Um, and speaking on that, I'm gonna go down like piece by piece, different sections of my review, and this first part will be about the characters. So obviously this is Hawkeye, so this is like centered around Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye slash Clint Barton slash Ronin, and his main like arc in this show is that he's struggling with the loss of Natasha from Endgame, and also paying for all the bad that he did in his time as Ronin in the during the Blip, the 5 year gap between Infinity War and Endgame, and a lot of that stuff is really good, like the emotional stuff with Jeremy Renner in the show. I think was done really well, and his acting is good in those scenes. And in terms of the action, like for him, I think he was really cool in the show, as I mentioned earlier. Um, and we did get a tease of that a little bit in What If, in that episode with him and Natasha versus the Ultron bots. And we definitely like they definitely expanded on that in this show, so that was really cool to see. And then as for his protege, Kate Bishop, I would say she actually really is the star of the show. Um, it really starts with her and then kind of ends with her. And it's her journey of becoming like a fan of a superhero. She's like a Hawkeye diehard fan because, minor spoiler, she was saved by him and the Avengers during that first movie when the Chitauri were invading New York. And she saw him like directly and was inspired by him ever since. So that's how like she starts off, but obviously by the end of the show she becomes a hero in her own right. Um, so that was really cool to see. And as for her like characterization, she definitely has a very childlike exuberance to her and a very strong like confidence level. She's also really funny and definitely a badass as well. Like her archery skills are definitely up there. And she does get some pointers from Clint and learns how to do some cool stuff throughout the show. Um, and then now I'm gonna talk about Maya Lopez, who was one of the new characters that I mentioned. I'm excited about to see her story continue. And in this show, she was basically like a girl who was wronged by Ronin after he killed her father during that time, during the blip. And in this show, she seeks vengeance against Ronin after he seemingly reappears. And she's pretty much like kind of ruthless in her pursuit to get that vengeance, and like she will not stop no matter what. And she also is a deaf character in the comics, and in the show they actually kind of um, added a little bit more to that. She also is missing her like right leg, I think. So she's an amputee and a deaf person. But it's not something that they like really kind of focus on. It's just an aspect of her identity. Like that's just how she is. But she is definitely a badass. Like she could kick a lot of ass. She had a few fight scenes with Hawkeye, and she was always putting up a really good fight against him. Um, so on that front, she's also dope. And then there's also this character called Kazi, and she's Maya's second in command, and he's a key member of the Tracksuit Mafia, who Maya can like kind of go to whenever she needs to talk, and he's pretty much the only one that like knows how to communicate with her with sign language. But they've been like close friends because he was also a friend to her father before his death. Um, and there's some good stuff between them throughout the show that we see. And then as for the Tracksuit Mafia themselves, like all of the henchmen, um, they're definitely very funny and fun to watch. But they actually kind of have like a certain quality to them that is kind of I don't want to say touching, but there's like an aspect to them that is kind of like not so bad. It's really funny how they just all of them just say bro all the time, and they even have like a company, like a shipping company or something like that, or a moving company called Trust a Bro, and it's always funny hearing them say that to each other and to anybody else. And then we did see at the end of Black Widow in the post-credit scene that Yelena was gonna be sent to kill Hawkeye, so she does return in this show. And Yelena Belova in this show is awesome and hilarious. And honestly, I liked her more in Hawkeye than I did in the Black Widow movie. And I also love her dynamic with Kate Bishop, who she had the most screen time with in the show. She's a badass with the action, and her personality is just so vibrant and fun to watch. And honestly, like I think she might be better than Natasha. Like going forward, she might be even more of a fan favorite for me personally. And Black Widow was one of my top favorite Avengers throughout the series, especially since Winter Soldier, which really changed a lot for Captain America and Black Widow in my mind. That's really when I started loving both of those two characters. And ever since, like they've both been on the top of my like favorite characters in the MCU. But in this show, like Yelena is a blast to watch. So I definitely think she has the chance to like get up there with Natasha and maybe even surpass her in terms of my enjoyment of the character. And now I'm gonna talk about the story. And I would say the story of Hawkeye is one about role models and the people that they help shape. And this is something that we see both in the protagonist and in the antagonist of the show. And it's also a story about choice and how your actions always have consequences. And we see that also in different ways with different characters. But as for like the role models, the main one is obviously Clint and Kate, the two Hawkeyes of the show, and that one is one of inspiration on Kate's part. She was inspired by Hawkeye to be a hero and to get into archery specifically because she saw that amongst these other like larger than life characters, there's just this regular guy with a bow and arrow standing up and fighting for the world and for the people that are helpless, like she was as a young girl and during those events. Um, so that was really cool. And then kind of the flip side of that is the relationship between Kate and Clint and like what she does for him. And what that is that through her and her exuberance that I mentioned, he's able to kind of have hope for the future and also forgive himself for what he's done in the past because of how she sees him, and he's able to realize that he isn't as bad of a person as he personally thinks he is. And obviously a lot of that guilt is from his time as Ronin, but also throughout his entire Shield career, he's done a lot of bad things probably. Um, so that was also kind of cool to see and very touching. Um, and then the other like key relationship in the movie is between Maya's uncle, who we get introduced to in episode 3, and Kazi, who is also part of that like little family, and her. And I'll talk a little bit more about this relationship later on because it does kind of get into spoilers a little bit. Um, but it's kind of as you would expect with the antagonist, the flip side of what I said before, and it's kind of more of a negative relationship that comes out of that. And then as for how the characters' choices affect their like the consequences or what happens to them in the future. Clint suffers from the consequences of everything he did as Ronin, which puts his family, who have now come back from the blip, in danger in the present day. Because obviously everything he was doing as Ronin was as a response to losing his family, like he lost himself. But now that they're back, he has to deal with everything that he did then, which does put them in kind of in the line of fire. Um, and then as for Kate, she learns that being a hero comes with a lot of sacrifice, and it's not always as fun as like she was expecting it to be. But it does not deter her from pursuing that further. Um, which speaks to her character, like she does want to be good and want to be a hero, and heroes, they do have to go through a lot for that type of job. um, as for Maya, she learns the consequences of blindly following her leaders, and that vengeance is a cycle that could only be broken with peace. And that's something that she learns throughout the show, tracking Hawkeye down and kind of learning more about exactly what happened and why her father was killed by him. Um, but like I said, I'll go a little bit more into that later when I talk about the spoilers. And Yelena Belova also learns something similar to Maya in the show, but I would say she also learns to accept Natasha's decision in Endgame to sacrifice herself. And through that, she learns that she can't stop other people from making the decisions that they're going to make, even if she doesn't agree with those decisions. And no matter how hard she tries to stop it or wish it happened differently, because this is a minor spoiler, but I don't think it's really like huge. But we do find out in this show that Yelena was one of the people that went away during the blip. She was snapped out of existence in those 5 years, which a lot of people expected, and that's one of the reasons, besides just the Avengers friends that Natasha had, why she was so like adamant in making that sacrifice. Because she did lose her sister as well in that time. And when she gets back, obviously she learns that Natasha is gone. And once we see that post-credit scene in Black Widow, when she has somebody to blame for her death, she immediately takes that and runs with it, and that's like how she gets involved in the show. Um, but yeah, all of these characters I think had great arcs in the show. And now I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the action in the show, and I would say it's good to great throughout. Like none of it is bad, but some parts are definitely better than others. All of the Ronin stuff that we see, like we do see a few flashbacks, and then even some stuff in the present that is really cool. Um, all the trick arrows are awesome, and they definitely go all out with that aspect in the finale after it's first introduced in episode 3, and I think a couple of them appear in maybe episode 4 and possibly 5. But I would say my by far my favorite sequence in the show was the car chase that happens in episode 3, where they do a really cool one-shot take, and I actually saw A lot of that sequence in a sneak peek before the show came out on Disney Plus Day as part of Marvel's like kind of looking forward to the future little presentation or collection of like footage from other shows, and it ended with a large sequence of Hawkeye, and it was that one, and that got me super excited for the show. And that sequence, when it actually happened in the show, definitely delivered. Um, but unfortunately, the show was never able to like match that level of action in the rest of the show. But there were some cool moments though. In addition to that, like I would definitely say there's a lot of cool stuff in the finale that happened. Um, but overall, that episode with that car chase in general was my favorite episode of the whole show, and not just for that. But with the action, they do showcase Hawkeye's true skills for the first time in that episode. Um, and he might that might be like the coolest that he was in the entire show, but I cannot be 100% with that. Um, but in this episode, we also got the touching backstory of Maya. Like we see her as a little girl being deaf, like having to navigate through school in a different way from most kids. And like she learns to like lip read from the teacher, but it's kind of difficult for her because whenever she turns away, obviously she can't see what she's saying. So she kind of just does her own thing and does the work. And she has a really great scene with her dad, who we end up seeing later is killed by Ronin. Where like they're talking about how she wanted to go to a school that has other deaf students there, but he just couldn't afford it. And because of that, she has to find a way to live between two worlds: the world of her predicament, being deaf, and then also the world of everybody else. Because she is part of that world, so she has to be able to do both and be very flexible in that regard. And that's kind of something that kind of goes through her character until the end of the show, on more than just that basic level that I mentioned. Um, and in episode 3, they also set up a big character that was not fully introduced until later in the season, but that's going to be part of the spoilers. So I'm going to go to that now because that's pretty much all I have to say for the non spoiler part of my review about the show. So I'm gonna go back up to the character section and talk about this character. Um, this is when in episode 3 we're introduced to Maya's uncle, and right away from that moment that we are introduced, I knew immediately who it was, and it's Kingpin, because you see like they don't show you him in that episode, but they show like his hand and like the bottom part of him. They don't show him in the entire frame because it's kind of on Maya's level, and she's a little girl at that in that scene. But you could tell because he pinches her little cheek and like does a little chuckle, and you could tell he just from that it's Vincent D'Onofrio from Daredevil who played Kingpin in that show. And as soon as that happened, I was like super excited to see what they were gonna do more with him. And unfortunately, they didn't do anything again until the very end of the show. Like I thought he would have shown up sooner than that, but he didn't. He didn't show up until the end of episode 5, and even then, it was just an image of him with um, Kate's mom, Eleanor Bishop, and we find out that she is the one that was behind like the murder that happened in the beginning of the show, and she is the one that is the like actual bad guy. It's not her fiance. But then he gets his full reintroduction into the MCU in the final episode where we see him in the flesh and actually being a character in the show. And for me, it was a great return for him. I loved seeing him, and they definitely kind of picked up the pieces right from Daredevil. Like his character is exactly the same. He voices him the same way. He has the same like kind of body language and the same menace to him. that we saw in that show. And it was cool seeing a different like sort of build up to him in this show from the way they did it in Daredevil, because in Daredevil he did have that like kind of a secret, you know, keeping it close to the vest sort of persona to him, but we saw him in the show. But here it was like that, but without seeing him. So maybe for people who didn't see Daredevil, it was more like kind of like, oh man, who's this guy gonna be, or trying to build up kind of that dread with him. Um, for me personally, I think the way they did it in Daredevil was better, actually having him be a character, because that's the only like kind of negative I have about it, is that he just wasn't in the show enough, so he didn't leave a huge impression on me. But I am excited to see where they take his character in the future, and I did like seeing him in here, like what he did here compared to what Matt Murdock did in Spider-Man No Way Home. This was definitely better because he still had a bigger role, whereas Matt in No Way Home didn't really serve any purpose, in my opinion. So I was at least happy about that, and I definitely hope they cross paths again in the MCU. And we don't even know for sure if it's the same exact like Kingpin and Matt, or if the Daredevil universe was like a branched timeline or a separate timeline from the main MCU that we're seeing. So they might not have even ever actually crossed paths yet in this version of events. But either way, I'm excited to see what they do with him. So now I'm going to talk about that relationship between Maya and Kingpin, and what that did for like the relationship of like follower and role model. Um, and that relationship with Maya was one of betrayal, because she finds out from Clint himself that the one that hired him to kill, or the one that like tipped him off and led to the death of her father, was actually Kingpin himself. And I think that happened through Kazi. Like he was the informant because he was not there at the meeting, even though he was in town the night that that happened. Um, and I think the reason for that is because Kazi wanted to take control of the operation, and Maya's father was the one in charge at that time. And because of that, the relationship between Kazi towards Maya is one of envy, because Maya is the one that is in charge now, because she was not there at that time, so she obviously lived that scenario too. And because her dad was the one in charge before and she was still there, she kind of took like the as the heir of that enterprise. So Kazi's just kind of been waiting for his time in the spotlight. And then as for Uncle Fisk, Kingpin towards Maya, what he feels is more disappointment, because when she finds out, she doesn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. And she just wants to leave, but obviously he's not gonna let that happen just like that. So he does have Kazi like try to kill her, but doesn't work out for him, and she ends up getting the upper hand. And as for like what happened when she saw Kingpin at the end of the episode of the finale, she shot him, and I think it was two gunshots that went off, and a lot of people might think that she killed him, but because they didn't show it, like they zoomed up before she shot, he's 100% not dead. And what I think actually happened is that she might have like shot him twice in the face and made him lose his eyesight, because something like that happens in the comics, and that's what happens. He loses his eyes after she shoots him, so he probably survived that attack by her, because this dude's unkillable. As we saw in this episode, he got hit by a car, blown up, and this motherfucker was still walking away like it was nothing. And I do think that Kingpin does have some sort of love for Maya, like he tells her in the episode. But because Kingpin's such a complex character, his love does not outweigh like his ambitions in terms of being king of New York. But before she shoots him, he's trying to like reason with her and appeal to her on that emotional level, but obviously doesn't do nothing. And she was just gonna leave, but at that point she was like, "Nah, fuck this dude." That's when she shoots him. Um, but yeah, I'm really excited to see more of Maya. And she is gonna have her own like spin-off series called Echo, which is her like alias in the comics. So as soon as episode 3 came out and we saw her whole backstory, I was like already super excited for that show. And honestly, I think that show will be a lot better than Hawkeye was. And I cared more about her story than I did about Hawkeye's story in that episode, and still until the end of the series. But I do feel like they didn't do anything as interesting with Maya in Hawkeye since episode 3. Like she kind of was just there. Um, so I am excited to see what they do with her in the future. And some other spoiler stuff that I want to talk about is like some of the plot threads that happen in the show. And the first one is the Rolex watch that happened in the first episode. That's kind of what set everything off in terms of the events of the show. And we learned that like the tracksuits were the one trying to get it, and obviously the tracksuits are working for Kingpin. And at the end of the show, we see that he gets it back and he gives it to his wife, and that's who it actually belonged to, Laura Barden. But that doesn't make any sense to me because why would Kingpin want it? Like, what did he know about it that would have made it valuable to him? If he knew that it was connected to Hawkeye in some way, he could have just figured out who his family was easily without having to get the watch the way Maya figured it out if he wanted to go after him. And I don't even know why he would want to do that. I do have a theory that Hawkeye or Ronin was basically puppeted by Kingpin during the blip to take out all of his enemies, and that's how he kind of got back into power. And that's why he's at the top again in this show, and that's why he killed Maya's dad. He was one of the people that Kingpin kind of set him on the path to. But in that case, I don't know why he would want to do why he would want to go after him now. Um, like, did it have any other secrets, like something inside of it? If so, they should show that, but they didn't. So I feel like the whole Rolex thing was kind of dumb. But it was basically just to confirm that Laura Barton was a Shield agent, which Tony Stark predicted in Age of Ultron when his family was first introduced. So that is kind of interesting. And Agent 19, which is the inscription that it had on the back of the watch beneath the Shield logo, is actually in the comics a character called Mockingbird, and she's her real name is Bobby Morse in the comics, and she was actually in the Agents of Shield show. But I kind of have a feeling they're two completely different characters because Hawkeye's wife here is Laura, so she might have been like the OG Agent 19 or Mockingbird, and then Bobby Morse in Agents of Shield was like somebody who picked up that mantle. But I do think that they could still connect them, like they could still be in the same universe. Whether that happens or not, we just have to wait and see. But I do personally like prefer Bobby Morse from Agents of Shield. She was a really cool character in that show. And the reason they did that is because Mockingbird and Hawkeye were a couple and did get married in the comics. So they kind of wanted to tie that up a little bit in the MCU, even though they're not necessarily the same character. And then another thing that I was like kind of thrown off by in Hawkeye is Yelena's story. Like, we see at the end of Black Widow that the one that gives her the assignment to go after Clint was Val, but she didn't show up or was even referenced at all in this show. So like that was kind of weird to me because why would the assignment come from Val if she was actually hired by Eleanor Bishop under Fisk's orders? Like, I mean, it's possible, but they didn't really go into that at all. So it's just like, I don't know. Like I'm trying to figure out what Val actually is, and they could have done something with her in the show, but they didn't. So it's kind of like they're kind of just dragging it out for like no reason, and I'm not even that really interested or invested in Val. I just kind of know what they're planning or what's going on because she seems to be building a team up, which I did mention in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier review. And I don't think anything in Hawkeye will really lead into that any of that stuff, other than that Yelena will probably still be working with Val going forward. Um, but I don't know. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the Hawkeye show. This was my least favorite of the shows that were released this year. But I did overall enjoy myself. Like it was still a good time. Um, but I don't need a season two, so I'm good if they just end it here and then just continue all these characters' stories in other places. But we'll see what happens. So far, they have not confirmed another season, but a lot of people did like it, so it could go either way. But that's all I have to say. So thank you for watching my video. I'll catch you next time. Peace.